All right, welcome to another episode of The More You Know. And wow, what a week. It's like I kind of forgot all about the show, and then weekend hits, and that's when it hit me like, oh God, I have to find a guest. But luckily today, Brendan Black is here to join us on The More You Know to talk about agriculture. Brendan, can you give us a brief introduction?
Yeah, absolutely. Thanks for having me on. It's sure a pleasure to have been on here. Yeah, so my name is Brennan Black. I'm a podcaster as well. I have a podcast called Talk Ag to Me, and it's all about agriculture, the topic of today's discussion. Yeah, I'm actually a college student out in California, and I've been podcasting for about 3 years now, and it's just something I'm really passionate about. But I love having fun conversations about things that people typically don't always know about, and agriculture seems to be one of those topics. So that's my bread and butter right there.
What really got you into agriculture, really?
So I grew up in a small town in Central California called Tulare, and Tulare is basically we call it cow town for a reason. I mean, there are dairies as far as I can see. I mean, like you walk outside, you can either see or smell a dairy somewhere around you. And so I have always been surrounded by agriculture, cornfields and cows and just cotton fields, like that kind of stuff has always been around me, and a lot of my family friends have been farmers, and so I was kind of it's always been in my life, but it wasn't really an interest of mine until I got into high school. When I got into high school, I joined a youth leadership program called FFA. I'm not sure if you've ever heard of FFA or not,
What
but
is it?
FFA it stands for the Future Farmers of America, or at least it used to. That's a long story. But basically, it's a youth leadership organization that's all about training high school students to basically be leaders of the world. Be able to do public speaking, job interview kind of stuff, lead teams, problem solving, and it's all rooted in agriculture. So everything we learn, our resume building, our business strategies, our leadership potential, our public speaking is all based off of agricultural lessons. Like I had a biology class that was all about the biology of farm animals, and I had business classes that were talking about the stock market. But we talked about agricultural futures instead of typical stocks, and so or I had like a veterinary medicine class. It was basically like a biology class or more advanced biology class, but it was about again agricultural animals and their medicines, not human medicine. So it's more about learning. I learned how to public speak by talking about agricultural issues, talking about the water situation in California, or talking about GMOs or urban sprawl or that kind of stuff. So I learned about everything I know about agriculture through my high school program, and so a lot of it came from my parents too. I mean, they were involved in agriculture growing up, and so they taught me quite a bit. But it was really getting involved in that program that kind of sparked my passion for agriculture, and that was actually the inspiration that made me want to go on and study to become an ag teacher, just like those who trained me. So it's it's kind of it's not to say that I never had an interest in agriculture, but it definitely wasn't what I saw myself doing long term until I really got involved in the the industry and in the issue side of it, and like the leadership part of it, and that kind of stuff just got me fired up and got kind of motivated me to go on and do what I'm doing now, the podcast, studying to become an ag teacher, kind of helping mentor other people who are involved in agriculture and help them find what they want to do with their lives.
Since you became really big into agriculture and learning more about like how our food is grown, what implications it has on either the environment or even in your case financially, ever since you grown an interest in this, has this changed your way of eating?
Um, I wouldn't say necessarily. It does make me more aware of what goes into our food and kind of what is going on, in behind the scenes, behind the curtain of our food. And so I wouldn't say necessarily. I would say it's influenced my eating, but hasn't really changed it. And what I mean by that is like I didn't, I already didn't eat. Sorry, I didn't eat a very particular type of diet before getting involved in agriculture, but being involved in agriculture has kind of helped me sustain my belief that the United States has the safest food supply in the world, that the food that we're eating is safe and well well tested before it gets to our shelf, that the technologies and science involved in agriculture is safe and not just safe, but it's necessary for production on a large scale, all that kind of stuff. So really my knowledge of agriculture, my involvement in the industry has helped solidify my understanding of the food industry, but I wouldn't say it's necessarily changed my diet in any way. And that's really massive.
Gotcha, gotcha. And while we're on the topic of diet, you want to give your piece on the plant versus meat based diet?
Always. This is a fun conversation. I love having this one. I actually just did an episode on this that came out last week. It's kind of funny we're talking about this, but yeah. So the plant versus meat based diet is one of my most favorite conversations to have about agriculture, just because it's one of the most heavily debated and one of the most like closely related topics to consumer life. It's not necessarily, we don't have to talk about the farm and what's going on the farm, and people lose interest in that kind of stuff, but we're talking about actual food and what people put in their bodies, and that kind of stuff seems to be more interesting to them. And so I will say, just for the record, that I'm more on the meat-based diet side of things. I'm not, I'm not, I'm more omnivorous in my diet. I'll eat my leafy greens, but I sure do like steak. But I definitely don't criticize those who follow more vegetarian or vegan based diets. Those are completely fine by me. The problem I have with it is when people uh, start to basically influence others in how they should be choosing their diets without really any information on why that's the case. The actual diets themselves don't have massive differences between them. People will say that plant based diets are healthier, but that's typically not the case. Like you'll see like numbers that say that a vegan diet's healthier than a meat based diet. The reason for that is because people who are eating those diets have to be more careful with what they're eating, and because they have to look for ingredients, all that kind of stuff. So just by byproduct, they're going to eat healthier things because they're trying to avoid certain ingredients. So it's not necessarily that the lack of meat is making them healthier. It's that they're being pickier about what they're actually eating, and that's making them healthier. A vegan cake and a non-vegan cake are still bad for you. They're the exact same nutritional content. It's just which one you prefer to shove down your throat. So it's not really that the plant-based versus meat-based diet is which one's good, which one's bad. It's more kind of a lifestyle choice and which one you prefer, for whatever reason you may have. I know people who eat plant-based diets for a variety of different reasons, whether it be ethical or environmental or financial, or whatever the case may be. They have a lot of reasons for eating plant-based diets, and that's perfectly fine. More power to them. But I don't think it's productive to say that anyone who doesn't eat a plant-based diet is a bad person by any means.
Yeah. Yeah, I definitely agree. I'm more of the meat eater type, and I'm just like you. I do enjoy my leafy greens when the time is right, but if I have two options, I always go with like a steak or like a hamburger. Um,
Oh yeah.
could you do you know much about like the manufacturing, or I don't even want to say manufacturing, but like the processing between plant-based and meat-based? Like what, like where, like I'm not really educated on this type of topic with like the plant-based. So is there a difference between the processing of the meat-based versus the plant-based?
Well, it depends, because typically excuse me, typically plant-based diets are they're composed of a lot of different types of foods. So I mean, like, there's not really much of a difference. Like the crops that are getting harvested and the meat that's getting harvested, they get processed the same no matter what diet they're going to end up being in. It's the final product that makes the change. So if you're eating a plant-based diet and you choose to eat a bunch of kale and fruit and lettuce and carrots, all that kind of stuff, those foods are going to be processed the exact same no matter how they're grown, no matter how where they come from, no matter who's buying them. It's just that the final, whoever buys them, however they handle them, that's what makes the difference. So it's not like they grow carrots that are going to be vegan carrots. All carrots are going to be vegan carrots. That's just kind of how they're grown, and they're processed the exact same no matter what. So they all go through the cleaning process, the packaging process. They get like their labels put on their package, and they get sent to the store. So really the processing between different types of dietary foods is exactly the same. But I will say, I'm assuming kind of where your question is going is more along the lines of like how you see like plant-based meats. So like you have like veggie burgers, and you have stuff like stuff of that kind of sort. That kind of goes through a bit of a different process, but it's not so much of like they basically just process the crops the same. It's just that after the crops are processed, they usually do something with them. So like they'll turn soy into like a patty, or like a like more of like a ground beef style food source, but that usually gets taken excuse me, taken care of by like the packaging property or the packaging companies, and less so by the processor. So yeah, most like the cleaning and the actual processing, the cutting, all that kind of stuff, the grading, that happens all like basically they're all equivalent at that point.
Yeah, and that was one thing that I was wondering too, because I know like a big thing. I think it was like a year or two ago was when these restaurant chains would be introducing for example Burger King came
Hmm.
out with the Impossible Burger, and all of these restaurants started coming out with burgers that are vegan or
Hmm.
vegetarian, but they taste just like a hamburger. And that brings me to when I'm grocery shopping too. I see a lot of Beyond Meat, and it's all
Hmm.
like vegetarian and vegan based patties, but they look exactly just like meat. So are these kind of just considered like GMO based patties or meats then, since they're kind of being modified from like soy to look like meat?
No, not necessarily. So the soy might be genetically modified, but it's not genetically modified to look like meat. So GMOs are kind of a different thing. With this soy, they basically are just grinding it up to look like meat. Because like they take the soy crop, soybeans or whatever it is, and they kind of like ground it up and turn it into, like a substance with food coloring and all that kind of stuff to make it look like meat. But they're not actually changing the crop at all. It's still soybeans at the end of the day. Like everything about it is exactly the same. They do some flavoring tricks with it with different chemicals to try to make it taste like actual beef, but it's not. They're not modifying the crop when it's being harvested to become that. So they don't have like veggie burgers, soybean crops that are just they're not necessarily harvested just to be that product. It kind of just ends up that way. Genetic modification typically happens before the seeds even planted, and the genetic modification usually influences how much of the crop can grow, how it resists pests, how it resists weeds, how it resists weather, how much water it can take up, how much of a product it gives off. So like genetically modified corn, for example, might give off like 30 to 40% more yield than non-genetically modified corn, and it might be able to resist certain bugs and weeds and maybe wind, and it might absorb less water, so that way it's more efficient. Like that's the kind of stuff that genetic modification typically goes into, not so much cosmetic stuff like what they would do with the soybeans to make them look like burgers. More of that is just kind of done after the fact.
There's one thing that I'm curious on too, while we're on the topic of this, is factory farming. I
Mm-hmm.
know that there's a lot of people out there that are very against factory farming, only because they see the videos of how bad these animals are treated, of how like there's videos of like cows just being crammed together in like a factory. And then I know that like 2 years ago or so, there's that leaked video from Fair Life of people just straight up kicking cows in the face.
Mm-hmm.
Um, like factory farming, it doesn't look good from what we see on the outside. What are your takes on the whole factory farming industry?
So I have an issue with factory farming, especially with the terminology of it, because technically the way that people describe factory farming, it doesn't really exist that way. People tend to think of factory farming as almost like an assembly line. You have like caged animals, and you just kind of move them along a conveyor belt, and then you just harvest everything from them, and then you move them on. That's not really how agriculture works, especially in the modern age. It's weird to think that agriculture has simultaneous simultaneously been conflated with being super simplistic, where it's just one guy in overalls, with his one, with his pitchfork and his cornfield, and he's got one cow that he milks with a pail. And at the same time, people also think that farming is mechanical, and it's in a warehouse, and everything is locked in a cage, and they just harvest it whenever they need it, and like neither of those pictures are entirely accurate. Um, Agriculture has become a lot more automated lately. There's definitely been advancements in technology to make agriculture more efficient. We have robots, we have drones, we have artificial intelligence, all that kind of stuff is used in agriculture to make the processes go by faster. But at the end of the day, the well being of animals has always been the priority of the farmer. There are videos out there of people mistreating animals, of them keeping them in unsanitary conditions, of abusing them. That kind of stuff does happen. I'm not going to say that doesn't, but those types of people are often condemned by other farmers. You know, people tend to not associate with those types of people. Like we don't say like, oh yeah, that's just it's just a he's a fine farmer. It's just you caught him at a bad time. Um, that does happen occasionally. If like let's just say there's a cow that needs to be milked and she's freaked out for some reason and she's not moving into the barn, and you have a farmer behind her that's pushing on her. If she slips and falls because it's raining and it looks like the farmer pushed her down, then things can be taken out of context. But that's not to say that every video that has been ever been posted is just taken out of context. There are a lot of them have to do with just people who are bad at the practice, or people who don't make good farmers. Because there's bad people in everything. There's gonna be bad apples no matter what tree you look at. But the same goes for other industries as well. It's not just agriculture. But at the end of the day, the amount of good farmers to the amount of bad farmers is such a distinct ratio. I mean, like what we consider factory farming is actually what makes up most of agriculture. It's just large scale farming that tends to scare people. People think of like these massive farms where there's thousands of cows, and they say, oh yeah, that farmer could never be able to identify and recognize every single cow on his dairy and know that if one of them gets sick, that cow needs to be treated with this thing. You'd be surprised. Those farmers treat those cows as if they're their own family. They take care of them as if they're young. So it's not really in the best interest of the farmer to mistreat their animals, because a lot of what happens with that kind of stuff is if you mistreat an animal, it doesn't really produce a good product. If you mistreat a cow, the milk is either going to taste bad or you're not going to get any of it. If you mistreat a pig or a bull or a steer, its meat's going to taste terrible, and sometimes it can even make you sick if it's too stressed out. So it's really bad practice to mistreat animals, because it tends to result in a weaker product, which also makes the farmer less money. So I mean, like, really at the end of the day, happiness should be the goal for every farmer, and for most farmers, it is the goal. They try to do everything they can to keep stress off of those animals, to keep them happy and contained, and healthy. And when I say contained, I don't mean in cages. They're often in corrals or pens, and there are actually regulations, and there's laws in place that prevent cows from being contained in areas that are too small for their own comfort to be able to survive. And so while there are some people who break that law, most farmers and most agriculturalists, and what people would consider factory farmers, they do abide by those laws too, because at the end of the day, they don't want their cows to be stressed out. They don't want to be cramped up in one pen. Sometimes they have to be for a variety of reasons, but it's typically not for more than an hour or two before they can move them out to a larger pen. So I will say that while some of those things that are in those videos is true, for most cases that's kind of it's somewhat hyperbolized. So I would say it's worth doing research on that kind of stuff before you just believe the first video that you see on it.
Yeah, yeah, I definitely agree with that. And I think that's kind of like the major issue with that, because people only see one video based on it.
Right.
They don't see other perspectives of it, because they're kind of just letting one bad apple ruin it for the rest of us.
Hmm.
Um is it more of like big companies that do practice more unethical ways of manufacturing,
Um,
or would it
it
be?
can be. It's hard to say, because now you're starting to get into corporate farming, which corporate farming is also often conflated with factory farming, but they're slightly different. Again, because I personally have a hard time defining factory farming, because it's not really what people say it is. But corporate farming can result in that kind of stuff, but at the same time, it's not really like you don't have a whole lot of massive companies that control a lot of farms. Like, most farms are actually ran by families. I think it's like 98% of farms are family farms. They become corporate level once they reach a certain size, but that's mostly for business operations. It has nothing to do with a company owning it. Like, McDonald's doesn't have farms. McDonald's buys their product from farms, but they don't have their own farm. So you're not going to see like a cow being abused because it's owned by a McDonald's chain. Um, there are some companies that own farms, but they're kind of few and far in between, and they're mostly agricultural based companies. So, like Lions Raisins is one that comes to mind. They have actual grape fields that they raise their own grapes. But you don't have a whole lot of companies that own massive farming operations like that, and the ones that do, I'm sure that there's some corruption in some of them, but a lot of the time, the CEOs, the big wigs that are running the companies, they have no control over the small operation. They usually delegate that kind of control to somebody who actually knows how to manage a farm, and so typically you won't even see it on that operation. It's kind of it actually, I've seen more examples of that kind of mistreatment happening on small scale farms than I have on large scale farms. I've been to quite a few large scale farms, and maybe that's just because large scale farms tend to get inspected more often. But I've been to quite a few large scale farms that have been very clean, very sanitary. They take care of their animals. Their animals are all bathed, and they're well fed, and they're happy and they're healthy. And I've been to some smaller farms that haven't really had the best conditions for their animals intact, and I'm not gonna say that they sat there and kicked their cows all day, but maybe they didn't clean their pens as much as they should have, or maybe they didn't feed them, on schedule every day, or but that practice is going to end up, biting the farmer in the butt. It's not really going to be something that, yes, there could be legal action taking place, but that farmer is going to go bankrupt within a couple of years if he hasn't fixed that practice. So really, the market punishes the farmer more than the laws can.
That's fair. That's fair. Um, there was a question that popped in my mind when you were talking earlier about kind of like the treatment of how the farmer treats an animal, and then if they treat them bad, the worse that their byproduct is really. Either
Right.
that be milk or their meat. My question to you is: have you ever, like, throughout your practices and like learning, have you ever like had an example of like a cow or any animal that was treated fair, that was treated good versus an animal that was treated bad? Have you ever tasted the difference between between the two?
So I can't say I've ever tasted the difference, but I have seen it. So whenever I was raising beef cattle back in high school for my FFA projects, I have had the opportunity to actually go to the slaughterhouse after we sold off our steers and actually see how they all graded out. And I can tell you right now, the kids who were out there every day with their steers, they cleaned their pens every day, they fed them, they made sure they were dry and healthy and happy. They took them for walks to get them exercise. Those kids, their steers graded out really high. They're very high valued meat. The kids who maybe would come out and feed once a day, hardly ever clean their pens, didn't take their animals out and walk them. When they would walk with their animals, they would just fight with them the whole time. Those animals tended to not grade out very well. And I never saw any that were completely inedible, but there were some that were pretty low on the grading scale compared to the ones that were taken care of well. So I have seen the examples firsthand, and I actually have a professor at my old college that my community college that I transferred from, and he did an entire study on this during his undergrad program on what's called dark cutters. So dark cutters are animals, and I think that his example was on the pork industry, but it might have been on beef. I'm pretty sure it was on pork though. He ran he did all this research on pork on pigs that were raised under harsh conditions versus pigs that weren't, and there's actually quite a few results that showed that the pigs that were raised under harsher conditions had meat that was so dark red. And I'm sure pork is typically kind of a lighter meat. It's almost considered a white meat because of
Yeah.
how light it is. This meat was so dark red that it almost looked like beef, and anyone who ate it got sick almost instantly. Like even no matter how well it was cooked, this meat was incredibly dangerous to eat. And so it showed that the higher stress levels an animal was under, the less and less edible their meat was, and potentially dangerous their meat was. And so it kind of really put into perspective the value in taking care of your animals and keeping them stress free.
And when you said that when you went to the slaughterhouse and you were seeing like the grading factors of it,
Mm-hmm.
what was like the big difference between like cattle that was raised good versus the cattle that was raised bad? Was it just the color of the meat, how tough it was, or what
Mm-hmm.
what went into consideration to consider the meat good?
So whenever you look at cattle, whenever you're grading their meat, there's a few things you want to look for. Big thing is intramuscular fat. So that's like whenever you look at a steak, all like the white stuff inside the steak, that's intramuscular fat. You want a lot of that because that means that your animal has a healthy balance of muscle and fat, and that's going to be a very very good tasting steak. Um, I mean, you could just see on the actual steer before it was slaughtered. The ones that were taken care of very well were very well finished out, which means they had like a full belly. They were, very muscular. They were very, their fat to muscle ratio was really good. And the ones that weren't very well taken care of were very skinny, kind of scraggly. Their hair was all matted and nasty, and their hair health actually depends a lot on their nutrition too, kind of like with humans. So you could tell they were kind of malnourished. They weren't super well taken care of. And when you look at their meat, the difference between their meat, the steers that were taken care of, they had much larger ribeyes, and that because the ribeye is where they do most of the grading, so they had much larger ribeyes. They had a lot of intramuscular fat. The fat was very, or the meat was very tender. It was very well, it was a good like pinkish color. And then the animals that weren't taken as well care of, they had less intramuscular fat. They had less like the meat was more lean almost. It was kind of like a darker color. It wasn't quite as attractive, looking, and so it would typically grade lower on the scale. So that was kind of the more physical differences you could see between the two, but I'm sure they tasted quite a bit different as well.
So when you're at the grocery store now, are you able to like select the meat that is going to taste the best? Like if you were at the grocery store right now, what could people look at when they're looking at either steaks, pork, meat, anything to kind of determine like the one if the animal was in good health, and two if it's going to taste better than the other options that are presented in front of them?
See, this is a really fun question because so I work in a grocery store right now. I'm working in the Gibson Farm Market, which is my college's extension farm store where we sell all of the products that's grown on my school's campus. And so I'm actually creating a guide right now for the store that is kind of like a how-to for mostly for our produce, but I'll probably eventually do it for meat too. But it's basically breaking down like so like just for example, I'm doing it on oranges right now. So if you were looking at oranges, what qualities would you look for in a good orange? What should you avoid? What kind of stuff is harmful to you? What's not? That kind of stuff. You can apply that to meat too. So I'll go over the oranges a little bit later, but for meat, for example, um, like I mentioned, you're going to want stuff with a lot of intramuscular fat. So you want meat that's kind of like a lighter pink color, but kind of like that red color is nice too, as long as it's not too dark. But you want a lot of white inside the meat. That's kind of the first thing you look for is the intramuscular fat. The size of the ribeye is nice too, but it needs to be proportional. So if it's a really large ribeye with not a lot of white, that's not going to be as good as a smaller ribeye that has a lot of white. So you want everything to kind of scale. And like I said, the color is kind of a nice thing to look for too, but it's hard to tell because after they've been frozen for a while, they all start to kind of look the same. But typically, lighter colored meat tends to taste better on from what I've seen.
Yeah, that's honestly one thing that I've always been curious on when I'm at the store, really, because for me sometimes I look at more of the quantity over the quality,
Right,
but I'm trying to change that mindset into quality over quantity. Um,
right.
so in choosing steaks is like the big one because you are looking for like the best cut that's in the stack of everything else. Um, Question for you, just personally, do you prefer grass-fed meat or grass-fed beef versus regular ground beef?
It's funny that you asked that. I actually I was raised like I said, I was raised in Tulare around dairymen. There's a dairyman that lives probably about 15 minutes outside of my town. He's kind of out on the outskirts of Tulare, and he has a conventional dairy operation, but he also raises grass fed beef at his house, and he raises a kind of I wouldn't consider them an exotic breed, but kind of a rare breed. They're called British Whites, and they're kind of cool looking cattle. Like I think they're one of my favorite breeds of beef cattle, just because how cool looking they are. But he actually asked me because he was kind of new to the beef operation side of things, but he knew that I knew quite a bit about it. So he asked me to come and give a speech on behalf of the grass fed versus grain fed beef argument. And so I went over there and kind of explained, what the process is that, a steer goes through from the minute it hits the floor to the minute it becomes a burger, that entire process. And after explaining it, I actually had a bunch of people asking me questions, which was really cool. And one of the guys, I was at a grass fed beef event, and he asked me, okay, which one do you prefer, grass fed or grain fed? And it was a hard question to answer because I was at a grass fed beef event, but I grew up eating grain fed beef, and so I naturally will prefer grain fed beef. But I told him, it's kind of up to you, like whichever one you think is tastes the best. I personally have been raised on grain fed, so I'm more prone to picking that one. But I think there's nothing wrong with either one of them.
Grain fed, do you, when you say grain fed, do you mean like the regular ground beef that's in the store that's like kind of like generic?
Yeah, so yeah, unless if it's not grass fed, it's typically grain fed. Those are kind of the two main options. Yeah, your regular, casual like run of the mill beef is usually grain fed.
Yeah. So I'm also curious on like the packaging of it because if you look at the grain fed, it's more of like just like strains of meat combined
Right,
together. When grass fed is usually in the like vacuum sealed package and it's still bloody inside, and like the meat is just in like a block.
right.
What like why is it? Why do they differ in one versus the other?
So there's something about grass-fed beef, and this goes true for organic foods overall, and like a lot of the stuff that's labeled like non-conventional. So like non-GMO stuff, no hormone stuff, no antibiotic stuff. Anything that's labeled like that tends to be packaged differently. I've noticed, and the reason for that I think is just because they're trying to be more eye appealing. I don't think there's any real reason to package them differently because there's no real difference between the products at all. Like grass-fed and grain-fed beef have no real difference between them. They taste very similarly. Well, it depends. I've heard some people say they taste the same. I've heard some people say they taste completely opposite. Um, it like the nutritional content of the two are almost identical. There's no real difference between how they affect you as a person. Unless you have some kind of placebo thing going on. But really, the packaging I think is entirely just for commercialism. It's just to look different. It's just to kind of like be eye catching and kind of draw your attention like, oh, this one looks different. I'm gonna buy this one instead. Even though it costs a lot more for really no real gain.
I might be the one now that you mentioned the placebo effect. I actually might be a person under that because my friend told me more about grass fed beef and how it just tastes so much better than grain fed. Uh, and then the next day I go out and I go out to Kroger and I buy
Mhm.
some grass fed meat and I make it, and to me it tastes better, but I just might be under the placebo effect of like under what my friend told me and like what I've heard about grass fed beef. But yeah, that's that that is kind of crazy that
Yeah.
the packaging standpoint is kind of just for marketing, because if you look
Hmm.
at even organic ground beef too, I bought organic ground beef once and it's packaged exactly like grass fed, but
Hmm.
it's still just regular ground beef but organic.
Yep.
And I think that's crazy that we kind of put that into consideration of like, hey, if we vacuum seal something and put like more blood in it compared to like regular, we can upcharge it for $2 or $3 more per pound. And now that you put it into consideration of that, it's just crazy to think about.
Yeah, no, exactly. And it's funny, like that's kind of a joke that we make in the ag industry all the time is that, if you make something look more natural, it's automatically going to cost more. And that's just, that's how we've that's how the consumer market has kind of created itself because agriculture didn't really do that. The consumers, the people who weren't as connected to agriculture, they're the ones that said we want more natural product. We don't want stuff with hormones in it. We don't want stuff with any kind of pesticides or anything like that in it. We want all of our stuff grass fed and natural how it should be. We want it organic. And we're like, okay, well, it's going to charge. We're going to charge you $3 or $4 more, and there's not going to be any difference. And they said, okay, we'll take it. And so it's really like the only reason that it's packaged different, the only reason that it costs more, the only reason that like all that stuff happens is because people will pay for it. Like that is that like there is no there's no advantage to any of it. There's no real difference between it. Like if you think it tastes better, then that's fine. That's all that's all on you. You go do whatever you want to do. I've like I said, I've heard mixed results on the taste, but in terms of like the nutritional content and like if it's healthier for you, there's real no difference.
Well, crap. Now I have to do a taste test now, a blind taste test between grain fed and grass fed beef now, because now I'm curious of like if I'm under a placebo effect. So
Yeah, and
now
I
I'm
I have
curious.
heard some people that prefer grain fed that say that just grass fed doesn't taste as good to them. So it might just be the opposite placebo effect. It's hard to say.
This is crazy. Yeah, yeah. I'm definitely gonna have to try that out now because, like for me, I think grass fed beef cooks better and faster than grain fed. But
Hmm,
maybe I'm just
interesting.
under under a big placebo effect. And one more topic before we end this.
Hmm.
I want to talk about milk.
Okay.
So do you know the process of taking lactose out of milk and
That's
how
a good
that really
question.
happens?
I mean,
Or
that's
like
that's that.
or
Hmm.
like if not even that, let's talk about maybe all types of milk because there's that really big argument of almond milk if it's really milk because everyone's just like
Right.
how can almonds make milk.
Well, I know how they make almond milk. It's definitely not milk. But yeah, no. So I don't actually know the process of how they take lactose out of milk. That's a good question, which I should know this because I'm lactose intolerant, so I should know how that works. But I do know that I know how they make almond milk. So typically they put almonds in like water kind of and just like it's almost like a centrifuge. They just kind of spin it until the water basically soaks all of the almond juice out of it, and then they just put it through a strainer and get rid of all the holes, and then now they have almond milk. Like that's essentially how it happens. Um, it's yeah, that's that doesn't make you thirsty. I don't know what will, but um, it's I mean, I'm not a big fan of milk personally. I know that's kind of blasphemous coming from a somebody who's raised around dairies. I love cheese, I love ice cream, I love yogurt. I've never been a fan of the flavor of milk. I don't know why. I'm fully I support my dairy and all that kind of stuff, but I'm just not a big milk drinker, and so it's
Same.
hard for me to have conversations about the difference between the different types of milks because I really haven't tried a whole lot of them. Just because I know I don't like milk, so I don't really feel the need to try other types of milk. But I know people who have, and they say that regular, like lactose in all that, like regular milk tastes the best out of any of the milks, and the raw milk tastes the best out of any milks too. But that almond milk, that what's it, soy milk, all that kind of stuff, that it tends to not taste as good. And I know for a fact that there's different health benefits to it, but it's not necessarily healthier than regular milk. There's really almond milk provides different nutrients than regular milk does, and it actually has to be fortified with different vitamins just to be as nutritious as milk. But milk itself is like almost it's like borderline superfood with the amount of nutrition it provides you. And so, in terms of nutritional content, you're not really missing out on anything by drinking regular milk. You're not. There's no real advantage to drinking the other types of milks over that. I do know that much, except for A2 milk. That's a different thing.
Oh wait, what kind of milk?
A2.
I've never heard of that. What is that?
So A2 is kind of it's somewhat new to like the dairy industry. It got introduced a couple years ago, and it's you can only find it like up north, like Northern California. I don't know where it is on the East Coast. It's almost like it's like marketed like with the organic stuff, but it's not necessarily organic. Although a lot of A2 milk producers are organic operations, so they can be the same thing, but they're not always. But A2 is a special protein that's found in milk, and so basically in like lactose intolerant people, that what makes you lactose intolerant isn't that milk you're allergic to milk. It's that the enzymes in your body can't break down lactose fast enough, and so it just kind of goes right through you. So lactose intolerant people don't necessarily always get sick by milk. They often just pass it really quickly. That's the case for like me and my family, is that we just pass milk really quickly. Because our bodies can't produce enzymes fast enough to be able to break down that much lactose. But the thing is, some researchers found out recently that lactose intolerant people might not be lactose intolerant because it may not be that they can't produce enzymes to produce the or to break down the lactose. It might be that they can't break down the protein A2, which is in milk, and that is often what causes a lot of lactose intolerance, quote unquote. Um, like you have to be almost have to be like diagnosed lactose intolerant to know for sure if you can actually break it down. And there are some people who aren't lactose intolerant, they just can't break down the protein in that milk, and so they have to drink A2 milk because it has a different protein in it that's not going to that's not going to cause those issues for you.
Interesting. Yeah, I definitely have to research more into A2 milk because that sounds like an interesting concept. Because I always ask that because like for me, I'm not an avid like milk drinker either. But if I'm having like Oreos or cookies or anything
Hmm.
sweet, a glass of milk complements it really well.
Yeah.
For me, I don't handle lactose in the greatest way. So I switched to lactate milk or lactose free milk. But
Mm.
every time that I drink it, I'm always like, is this really good for me? Like if they're taking the lactose out of the milk, is this still considered really milk, or is it just like modified milk? Am I still getting the right nutrients? Am I still getting all of the benefits from regular milk minus the lactose? So that's always one thing that's been curious on my mind. But while I'm consuming it, I'm just happy that I'm able to consume milk at the time.
So I just looked it up right now because I was curious. So the way that they remove lactose from milk is literally just adding the enzyme that breaks down lactose into the milk.
Oh, okay.
So literally, it's just the same thing that your body produces to naturally digest milk. They just add a bunch of that stuff into the milk, and it breaks down the lactose for you before you drink it.
Whoa. So that's not necessarily bad, is it?
No, I mean it's exactly
It's
what's already in
natural.
your body. They
Oh,
just do
that's
it for you.
awesome. Oh
Yeah,
wow.
huh?
Taking
That makes a lot of sense. I never knew that. I'm glad that I looked that up.
so a question that stems from that, and I know that you might not have the answer, but one thing that I'm curious on that now is if it's supplementing the enzymes that break down the lactose for you and you consume it, is it putting is it making an imbalance in your body then
I
if you're
don't think
supplementing
so.
it?
I'm gonna say probably not because what happens whenever you digest milk naturally is all those enzymes that get produced just kind of form with the milk anyways, and so your body just kind of gets rid of them. So it's like your body isn't always naturally producing those enzymes. It only produces them when you digest dairy products. So or when you digest lactose technically. So if you don't, if you're not producing it all the time, then having, a supplement to it isn't going to throw off a balance because it's not making your body produce it. It's just already in there for you. So it's basically like it basically is almost as if it adds the amount that your body should normally add into it, and it just kind of mixes the same as it normally would. So basically it kind of like is like, hey, telling your body like you're good, I already have it covered, don't even worry about producing it, I'm already taking care of it. So I don't think it's creating an imbalance. I think it kind of just makes it so your body doesn't have to try as hard.
That puts my mind at ease now, and now I feel better drinking lactose free milk because now I know that one, it's not like GMOs or anything like modified, but it's just doing the work for me. Wow, look
Yeah.
at that.
Yeah. And that's, that like speaking of different types of milks, there's all kinds of like have you ever heard of Guernsey milk?
Guernsey, no, what is it?
So Guernsey is it's a breed of dairy cattle. So the two primary breeds of dairy cattle in the United States are Holstein and Jersey. Um, so Holsteins are the black and white cows. They're the ones that are super tall and they're big. Their full name is technically Holstein Friesian. They come from the Frisian parts of Europe and they're massive. Everything that's a Frisian is a massive. Like Frisian horses are huge. Frisian sheep are huge. Frisian bunnies are huge. Like Frisians are just massive. They're all Dutch, so they're all going to be tall. But Holsteins are they're the black and white cows. Their advantage is they produce more milk than any other dairy breed in the entire world. They produce like a ton of milk. Jerseys are the little brown ones, and they produce more butter fat. So they produce less milk on average than a Holstein will, but their milk is going to have a lot higher butter fat in it, which is useful for making butter and ice cream and other stuff like that. And then Guernseys are a breed of dairy cattle that aren't very common in the United States, but they do raise them up in like I think like the northern, like probably like Wisconsin and Montana and like those kinds of areas. And Guernseys are red and white cattle. They look kind of like Holsteins, but they're a little bit smaller. And they produce milk that is super high in beta carotene and vitamin A, like because beta carotene is the inactive form of vitamin A. And so their milk is orange.
Whoa.
And so, so beta carotene is present in carrots and pumpkins. That's what makes carrots and pumpkins orange. And there's actually a GMO called golden rice, which is regular white rice that has been genetically modified to contain more beta carotene in it. And so this rice is actually richer in vitamin A, and they actually use it to help kids who have like anemia and like childhood blindness and that kind of stuff. They send it to developing countries, so it's a cheap and affordable and readily available source of food that can actually kind of like fix some of their malnourishment. So I think that Guernsey milk just I don't know how it happens, but it naturally has more vitamin A in it, and that turns the milk kind of like an orange color.
That's crazy. I have to look that up more. I kind of want to try
Yeah,
that now.
yeah. Which it's funny because like my roommate actually asked me a couple days ago like why milk is white, which is a random question, but that's why. It's because because milk is super high in calcium, and calcium is a white it's a white mineral, so it turns the milk white. In Guernsey milk, there's still calcium there, but it's a lot higher in vitamin A and beta carotene, so it turns it more of an orange color. So the color of the milk depends on what nutrients are most prominent in that milk.
I This is all mind blowing to me now, and I'm definitely gonna look this more up and see if I can go to the store or somewhere around me that does sell different colored milk, and then it'll be awesome to apply this to a real world product that is actually in front of me. But uh,
Yeah.
but yeah, that is all the time that we have today. And Brendan, I can't lie to you, I have learned a lot today, and I am going to be more aware. Like I'm going to be more aware in the grocery store now. Well, like when I'm looking at meat, when I'm looking at like dairy stuff, and just applying to like literally what we talked about in this episode to real life.
Awesome. Well, yeah, I'm glad I was able to bring some new topics to your mind.
And where can my listeners find you?
So, as I mentioned earlier in the episode, my podcast is called Talk Ag to Me, and Agriculture for Agriculture. So it's it's Talk AG to Me, and you can find me anywhere you find podcasts. I'm on YouTube, I'm on Spotify, Google Podcasts, Apple Podcasts, all that kind of stuff. And then you can find my social media platforms, same place, Facebook, Instagram, Twitter, all that kind of stuff, just at Talk Ag to Me. I actually just started Talk Ag to Me TikTok that I'm playing around with, so check that out. But yeah, so I'm all over the place, and like my personal stuff is my full name is just Brendan Brendan Black. If you guys have any questions about agriculture, if you want to talk about it some more, if you have anything that I said in this episode that you disagree with or that I was wrong about, please let me know. I'm always happy to hear about that I was wrong because I like learning new things. So yeah, just reach out to me.
Yep, that's amazing. And everything that Brendan listed is going to be in the description of this podcast. So for if you want to check it out, easy access. But Brendan, thanks so much for joining me on this podcast. It was a pleasure sitting here and talking with you. I definitely learned a lot.
Yeah, thanks for having me.
All right, and that's a wrap. I hope you enjoyed this show of The More You Know. If you enjoyed this episode, please consider rating this podcast on Apple Podcasts. It'll certainly help me out in the algorithm, and be sure to subscribe or follow to The More You Know on your favorite podcasting platform like Spotify, Apple Podcasts, or Google Podcasts, or any of your favorite podcasting apps. And lastly, if you would like to contribute to The More You Know, you can head over to anchor.fm forward slash The More You Know Pod and contribute any monetary value to help the quality of the show, and in the future bring on some more interesting guests. Thank you so much, guys. I appreciate all of my listeners, and I hope you guys have a wonderful week.